Ruins across the landscape that give us clues that there was a once great civilization that encompassed the entire world. The civilization that we refer to as Tartaria. The civilization that preceded ours. And while we may not know its actual name or what language they spoke, we know that this civilization existed, found in the wondrous ruins that dot the landscape. Indeed, many still in use today by our current civilization. But how did this wondrous civilization fall? What was the final chapter in its true history? Today we are going to explore that when we look at the final conflict of Tartaria. The legacy of Gog and Magog, Tartaria's final conflict. In the Five Eras theory, we posit that there were several civilizations that preceded our own. There may have been 4, there may have been 5. These civilizations were destroyed by what we consider hard resets, and then the civilization had to begin again. Were these natural disasters, or were these artificially induced disasters that destroyed these civilizations? In the 4th era Tartarian civilization, we see that it had 3 phases: a rise, an ascendancy, and a decline and a fall. During its ascendancy, we believe that it won a great conflict against some unknown external enemy. We've posited at the locations and origins of this potential enemy. Yet in this exploration, we're going to consider the final conflict that Tartaria faced, which brought about the downfall of this wondrous civilization, the civilization that managed to build incredible structures all across the land. Cities that were built on top of the ruins of previous civilizations that we call the Foundation Eras. The Five Eras theory explains the fact that we do have deep structures with many foundations and many structures that are built on top of the remnants of previous structures. But there may have been many more eras. Indeed, the many memorials that we see across the land. Were these really memorials to national achievements, as we're told, great conflicts that we know of in our official history? Or are the other symbols that we see that don't make sense to us representative of something else? A great victory that Tartaria won in its first conflict during its civilization. Perhaps that explains why we see all these discrepancies with what we would think of as Civil War monuments or other great conflicts that we're told of in our history. Memorials that were simply repurposed and redesigned to reflect the achievement of Tartaria. And yet, Tartaria faced an adversary that it could not possibly overcome. The legacy of Gog and Magog. Gog and Magog, it has a biblical reference to it, although, oddly enough, it appears in multiple religions, mythology, or official history, or scriptures, or whatever you want to call them. Gog and Magog represents an evil force, originally referring to 2 individuals, and yet in many of the maps of the Mappa Mundi and the history of the Middle Ages, we're told that Gog and Magog represented an entire force of individuals. Perhaps it was this sort of external threat that faced Tartaria that they were unable to contend with. Or maybe it refers to the fact that many individuals within their own defense forces, this civilization's great leaders, who were corrupted or subverted by the external forces that had somehow been unleashed on their civilization. Or perhaps it was merely the same adversary that Tartaria's predecessors had faced, and now they had returned to exact their revenge on the people of Tartaria. Initially, their first conflict was unsuccessful. The unified peoples of Tartaria were unable to be overcome. Therefore, this invasion force, this external threat, had to change their tactics. And we have accounts of Gog and Magog being people who were completely and totally uncivilized, and perhaps not even human beings in many ways, shapes, or forms. We even have accounts that they were individuals who were cannibals and did not recognize the precepts of society. Whatever the reality is, we have many maps from the Middle Ages that indicate that the invaders of Gog and Magog were confined to a particular geographical area. And indeed, the residents and the denizens of Tartaria were threatened, as it seems as though these ruthless attackers were unrelenting in their efforts to completely destroy the people. But we just don't know if this was simply an external threat or if this was something that attacked Tartaria from 2 sides, externally and internally, as we do have accounts of individuals who were corrupted by the influences of Gog Magog. There's also the account of Alexander the Great, the hero, at least the hero when it comes to contending with the threat of Gog Magog. Gog Magog, the nation with uncivilized individuals that was destroying all the other civilized peoples of the world at that time. And maybe Alexander the Great represents Belisarius and Lucius Aurelian, leaders who we're told have a place in history, but may in fact have been the final leaders of the great Tartarian civilization, trying to defend it from the unrelenting attacks from the threat of Gog Magog. Many of the maps that we have from the Middle Ages, or the Mappa Mundi, indicate that the threat of Gog Magog was confined to a geographical area. They were trapped by walls and natural terrain features that were reinforced by obstacles. There are many different biblical references from both Christianity and Islam that indicate the actions of Alexander the Great and the threat faced by Gog Magog. Very odd for something that only came from one particular area of the land, that it's referenced by multiple civilizations and multiple religions in our current civilization, giving the indication that perhaps there's a lot more to these origin stories and this threat of Gog Magog than simple mythology or simple fantasy. When we look at many of the images in the accounts, we see various efforts by the people led by Alexander, the remnants of the Tartarian civilization, to attempt to safeguard their civilization by building walls and building forts and building outposts that would survive this attack. What we don't know is if this attack from Gog Magog came before or after what we consider the Great Reset event. There might have been a series of disasters that befell Tartaria, and they turned to their final great commanders to try to defend and safeguard their civilization. We know that their efforts failed over time, and yet we still have the remnants of their fortifications. We're told of great walls built across the land, and indeed the Gates of Alexander, which exists to this day in the Caucasus Mountain region, may have been an attempt to try to forestall this attack, this invasion by these forces of Gog Magog, this nation that had no civilized rules, that seemed to be unrelenting in its efforts to destroy the people of Tartaria. And when we look at the maps that we have, we can even find the natural passes through the mountains of the Caucasus. We're told that the Gates of Alexander fall right here, where there's reinforcing fortifications on the natural mountain passes. Although for all we know, perhaps the original mountains themselves may not be quite as natural as we're led to believe. When we study more of the maps of the advances of the individuals of Gog Magog, or this terrifying nation, or whatever this external threat truly was, we can see that the walls were not successful in keeping them contained. That eventually, according to subsequent maps, they spread across the entire land, destroying every civilization that came in their way. And indeed, we do have historical accounts that try to relate this to other nations that we're told were simple hordes that crossed the land. It wasn't just the Mongols, it was also the many other forces of the Huns and the barbarian invasions. Perhaps all these refer to the same force, the original force of Gog Magog, simply being hidden at different points in our history, with different individuals all referring to the same event. Perhaps the great leader Alexander the Great, whatever his name really was also corrupted by this influence. We have accounts and images that show Alexander the Great even working with the devil, or at least the forces of evil, to try to contain these forces of Gog Magog. Perhaps he fell to the corruption and the influence that had overcome many of the leaders of Tartaria, and this led to the unfortunate fall and total destruction of their civilization. After they were hit by the natural disaster, or perhaps it was an artificially induced disaster, they were left at the mercy of these relentless forces of Gog Magog. This would explain these isolated monasteries that we have, and what we view as reset compounds. Perhaps they were also survival compounds, the last-ditch attempt by a civilization that could see its end rapidly coming, trying to preserve anything and everything that they could of their civilization, their society, their true history, all that they had learned, even their architectural capabilities. And yet we know that very little of the previous civilization managed to reach ours. Indeed, to even question its existence is oftentimes ridiculed. But we can look at these subsequent maps and we can see that the remaining people of the world were the ones who were waiting for their final destruction, that the efforts of Alexander or whoever the commanders were had failed, that Gog Magog had succeeded in utterly destroying the Fourth Era civilization, or at least completing its destruction. Imagine a distant civilization in the past, under assault by various threats. What would that look like? How would that civilization actually respond to those threats? What actions would they take to ensure their survival? We have no shortage of examples of incredible fortifications across the land, built with knowledge that seems to surpass our current capability. But why would any great civilization build these wondrous fortifications, unless they were simply trying to survive their own incoming destruction by various threats that seem to be internal and external? Indeed, this is how we explain why there may have been a last emperor when we consider the Fourth Era civilization that we call Tartaria. The emperor in history. We have no shortage of emperors depicted in the histories of various cultures, and perhaps there's a reason for this. To this day, we appreciate emperors, and yet we loathe their existence. Here in this bust of Augustus, he seems to have a small homunculus, or a mini-me that's with him. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. And perhaps we start by considering the Roman emperors, as they tend to be the most well-known, at least in what we think of as Western civilization. And yet there's something very peculiar about these Roman emperors when we look at them. Again, we have the very original conflicting account. Some accounts say that these emperors were great leaders and individuals that brought the Roman Empire and ultimately the nascent Western civilization to the pinnacle, at least at the time. Or as the saying from Maximus in the original Gladiator, Rome is the light, and the rest of the world is chaos and darkness. Granted, that second part I just added. But when you look at these emperors, oddly enough, you're determined to see that there seems to be some sort of difference in some of them. And yet, many of the busts look exactly the same. Now, we could attribute this to the fact that they're made of marble, that many of these emperors were from the same family, and, of course, much like in the television shows, we have offspring that look exactly like their parents. But it's another one of those questions that we have to ask. We also consider the account that perhaps emperors, whether we're talking about Roman, Chinese, or any of the other emperors from across the cultures in our written recorded history, maybe one of them had to make a great sacrifice. A sacrifice that's reflected by emperors in fiction, such as the God Emperor in the 40K series. The God Emperor that had to make the ultimate sacrifice in order to save and preserve his civilization. We oftentimes wonder with these conflicting accounts of these emperors, did any of them have to make that final sacrifice? And the question I want to pose to all of you is, why do we have such a fixation on emperors? Whether we're talking historians or even the creators of fiction. There always seems to be an emperor, a great leader, a king, a queen, an empress. There's always one individual who seems to have a lot of the responsibility for the survival of a civilization that's attributed to this one leader. And indeed, when we look at the many different examples, whether we're looking at the Roman Emperor Trajan, or whether we're looking at one of the High Lords of Terra from the Warhammer 40K series, we oftentimes have these individuals who have a lot of responsibility that is attributed to them. Indeed, when you look at the bust of the Roman emperors that we have, one of the questions I've always had is, how exactly did they create these very accurate busts? And were they actually accurate in depicting the facial features? Such as with Emperor Hadrian here. Did they really know that his beard looked exactly like that? Was that the exact look in his eyes? Or was that merely creative license that was done by examining writings after the emperor had been alive? How historically accurate is all of this? Again, these are questions that we oftentimes don't ask because we have such an accurate account, or do we, of the existence of the Roman emperors and the imperial regalia of all of the Roman Empire. And it's the same questions that we have when we look at other civilizations and their respective empires and their great leaders. But was it actually inspired by something? Was there truly a leader who was responsible for the survival of a previous civilization? A civilization that encompassed all or most of the lands that we know of, and perhaps it even included lands that we're not aware of. Is it possible that such an individual would have such responsibilities? And that's the main reason why we have this fixation, if you will, for the existence of these single leaders. And whether it's a queen, a king, an empress, or an emperor, there is no shortage of historical and fictional accounts, although are the two interchangeable? It seems to be that they may be a little more interchangeable than we like to think, such as with the account of Maximus Thrax. Maximinus Thrax was stated to be between 7 and 8 feet tall if we go off of the Historia Augusta, which of course historians tell us it's not reliable. Imagine Maximinus Thrax being 8 feet tall compared to the average Roman being between 5'2" and 5'6". It seems to be an anomaly. And then of course there's the strange account of Emperor Lucius Aurelian, the emperor who was running all over the Roman Empire facing external, internal threats and currency revolts from within, and yet he still had time to pose for his bust being created. Of course, there are some that say that that's not actually his face. So what do we really know about these emperors? And even going on to the Byzantine Empire, another rather strange occurrence because this was actually the Eastern Roman Empire. The term Byzantine Empire was assigned later, oddly enough, by historians. So why exactly would we refer to an empire by a name it was not actually known by within the empire? Good reasons, I guess. Emperor Justinian, considered to be the one who really brought the so-called Byzantine Empire, that remember it was not really called, to its pinnacle. Did he represent some other individual? He had what is supposedly the great general Belisarius assisting him in his military endeavors. This is purported to be Belisarius, although we're not sure. There's also other odd individuals pictured here. And who exactly do these figures truly represent? And why is it that we have certain individuals that look like they might be out of place from a different time frame? This almost looks like F. Murray Abraham before he decided to star in Amadeus. And other strange-looking individuals. Were they actually the leaders who were assisting Justinian? That's what we'd like to believe. Or are these people completely different? Even looking at some of the soldiers that we have here, they have a strange look to them as well. Are these representing actual human beings, or are they different human beings? And indeed, it's not just emperors and empresses that we have to look at, but it's also the accounts of kings and queens, the individual leaders who seem to make a great difference within their nations that we still remember to this day. And yet, for whatever reason, it seems as though historical accounts assign or attribute more importance to them. And then, of course, we've looked at the account of Emperor Charles V. You might recall Charles V, he was the one who ordered the initial survey to be conducted of the feasibility of a canal that cut through the Isthmus of Panama, or Nicaragua, provided, of course, that, there wasn't something there that they could have used to make it easier, and the mainstream account tells us that there was. There's no shortage of the use of the title of emperor or king. What's really the difference, though, when we look and compare at the titles? An emperor who commands or rules an entire empire, and a king who rules a single nation. Did you know that there is still a recognized emperor to this day in Japan? And it's intriguing when we consider these various individuals and how they may have played a role within the affairs of their state or their nation state. It seems as though many of these borders and boundaries and national considerations are a lot more modernly imposed than we like to think. Why is it we have all this reference to these larger empires that may have existed? We also have to think about the fact that there may be certain nations that still exist with the same geographical boundaries, although there's a great debate about the whole concept of geographical boundaries. Was the existence of Japan in the distant past as limited as we've been told, or did it represent something else, something much larger and more grand and encompassing than we like to believe? Was there a completely different arrangement of society and cultures in the distant past? Of course, it's considered taboo to even ask these questions to this day, but they're questions that we have to ask because we do have many accounts that do have strange parallels to them. And one of the most basic parallels is the actual method and manner in which nations or empires, or the difference between the two, were ruled. In fact, we even have emperor kings or king emperors, or queen empresses. What's really the difference between these titles? And do these titles have any function at all? We also consider the account of Napoleon. Did Napoleon really exist, or did he represent some sort of commander who had gone past his charter during the reset conflict that followed the last reset? Or is it just simply another tale designed to give a little bit of veracity to the current mainstream account? Was this individual actually just a commander who'd gone too far with his authority, or did he not even exist? I've left that to you in the past, and I ask you to let me know in the comments. We also have many empresses in history, such as Empress Irene, and even though we're told that this was limited to the Byzantine Empire, it should be noted that these individuals wielded a lot of authority and influence. There was even statements that potentially Empress Irene was going to join another empire. And I'm once again always amazed at the unique attire that we see in the paintings and the artwork of the distant past. Does any of this look like it would be practicable to wear at any point in time? Of course, the official explanation for whether this was a more modern or a distant past image is that people simply like to look resplendent in whatever they were wearing, having suitable raiment to show their authority. Here we have Pedro II, the last emperor of Brazil. Yes, there was a time when Brazil had an emperor. And oddly enough, we have more than a strange resemblance to Ulysses S. Grant, especially with the facial hair. But what is really the truth behind this account of emperors and all these kings, and whether we're considering the account of one of the many Henrys from the history or the official history of Britain, or any of the other lands that had rulers named Henry? Indeed, when you look up how many rulers are named Henry, it's very peculiar. And why would one of the Henrys be visiting his father in this very small, almost dare I say, outhouse-looking prison? Or perhaps you could even say it's a porta-john prison. Maybe they had that in the distant past. And here we have Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Yes, this gets even more convoluted when you consider the Roman emperors and the Holy Roman Emperors. And Henry V, who ruled from 1111 to 1125. What exactly is he holding in his hand there? It looks like he has the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch in his hand. Not exactly sure. But again, it goes to this entire account of who these emperors really were. And indeed, who were these kings? And oftentimes, the entire study of history, and if you ever had the pleasure or the misfortune, depending on your perspective, of going through a class on the Middle Ages of history at any university, you'll find there's all these confused and conflicting accounts of these kings who sought authority. It looks like this particular individual has the entire city of Antioch in his hand, and not just the Holy Hand Grenade. But what does it really reflect? And indeed, what does the account of all these other leaders that we have? Few people are aware of the account of Empress Matilda, and yet she was involved in the secession or the dynastic struggles that occurred in England during the time of Henry and so forth. And let's look at the leaders of Tartaria. Who were the actual leaders? We've looked at the account of Alexander the Great before, and we know that according to official history, Alexander the Great is stated to have been the Macedonian general who unified Greece and then went on a campaign to conquer the Persian Empire. We also have the account of Belisarius, and in previous explorations, we've looked at how these commanders may have been involved in a great final conflict. The final conflict for the survival of the Fourth Era civilization. The civilization that we refer to on this channel as Tartaria. We have all of these different maps that seem to depict some great threat. And indeed, in the Crisis of Tartaria, we looked at the threat posed by what we view as the Empire, or whatever you want to call it, the peoples of Gog and Magog. Was this an internal or an external threat that was actually facing the Fourth Era civilization? And we've posited that it must have been both an internal and an external threat. And perhaps that's the real account with all these emperors and all these great achievements. There's also the many accounts of corruption and difficulty that they faced. Everyone's well familiar with the account of Nero, who fiddled as Rome burned. Was there some leader who was charged to attempt to save or preserve the civilization that didn't fulfill their duties, or had also succumbed to the corruption influences from within, as many others had? We've looked at the account of how Alexander the Great, also named in other societies and cultures which we would not normally associate with Alexander the Great, and the attempts of his forces to construct a wall to keep out these invading forces that threaten civilization. Indeed, many remnants of this Great Wall can still be viewed to this day in the Caucasus Mountain region, and it is attributed to the efforts of Alexander the Great, even though in the official history there's no account of Alexander the Great during his supposed historical time frame erecting these great fortifications. And it's also yet another account of, in the past, trying to utilize fixed fortifications to defend a civilization. Now, any military mind from any time frame will tell you that fixed fortifications are merely a monument to the intransigence of humanity. They tend not to work when you're facing a mobile army. But perhaps they make a lot more sense if you're trying to bring about the survival of your civilization and you're facing imminent annihilation. Or a more direct form for it is to simply say you're going into a hedgehog defense. You have no choice and you're simply trying to survive. And indeed, if we look at many of the great structures and many of the installations that are still around to this day, this suddenly makes a lot more sense. That the reason that they're still around is the fact that they were built to last and they were built to endure and to try to survive whatever forces and whatever threats that they were facing in that time. We've looked at other cities and other installations that still survive to this day that seem to have been constructed with threats from the air in mind. And you might recall our recent exploration when we looked at the lost tales of the Native Americans and all the settlements in the southwest of the United States that almost seem to have been built with the concept of defense or concealment from attack and observation from the air. A very unique and interesting series of details that once again paint conflicting accounts to what we've been told by the mainstream account of history given to us by the scholars who study and repeat what they are told to study and repeat. I always found the account of Alexander the Great the most intriguing because when you look at other cultures' accounts of Alexander, and you look at these supposed legends and myths that attribute him to being in the Caucasus Mountain regions and establishing these fixed fortifications to try to bring about the survival or try to enable the previous civilization to survive, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. But going back to the account of the actual emperor, I know that many viewers of this channel will certainly ask, Aurelian, you've theorized that in the past the leadership and the government of the Fourth Era civilization didn't rely on a strict hierarchy like we have now. And that's true. But I also have to consider the fact that we do have this idea of everything being brought about, all this responsibility, to one single leader. And whatever title we wanted to assign to that leader, it seemed to make sense to me that we have to consider the account that perhaps there was a series of leaders or one final leader, the last emperor, who tried to facilitate the survival of the Fourth Era civilization, the civilization we call Tartaria on this channel. But what kind of efforts did they really have to go through, and were they really successful? Ultimately, we can conclude that they were not successful, that indeed the entire civilization was destroyed, both from within and without. But what sort of terrors did they really face? What efforts did they really go through to try to survive the crisis? And we have explored the crisis before and what it was really about. We've had symbolic representations in recent events such as Olympic opening ceremonies that point to a different possibility concerning what the previous civilization may have faced. That it seemed as though that there was some sort of portal or some sort of access point that opened, allowing the others to access this land or this realm or whatever you want to refer to it as, and that this threat was unlike anything that they had faced. They had managed to overcome it in the direct conflict, but yet it seems that this adversary, this opponent, changed their tactics. They managed to infiltrate the very essential infrastructure, and indeed the institutions of the Fourth Era civilization, Perhaps they even had the ability to corrupt the individuals from within. And no doubt they would have targeted the leaders. They would have targeted those who had the responsibility. And perhaps that's the real cycle that we face. And it explains the very basis of the 5-era civilization that this channel uses to try to explain what came in the past. Because if we had 5 eras in the past, it comes about that it's always a cycle. There's always a civilization that manages to rise and reach a pinnacle. Now, how far each civilization that came before ours reached, we can debate it. But we have a lot of indicators that they managed to build wonders beyond our imagination. Indeed, no one can tell you exactly how a pyramid was constructed. We have many theories, but that's exactly what it remains to this day. Even from mainstream history, just theories in terms of how these structures were constructed. And whether we're talking about a pyramid or even an Art Deco building, we have so many questions. The main question being, why is it we can't construct these structures today in the manner that they were constructed in the past? And even when we look at the images that we have of the previous eras, what things may have appeared as, whether we're looking at the elaborate and geometrically precise star forts that may have existed in the 3rd era, and they may well have been the foundation of the structures that were built on top of by the 4th era. And indeed, we still have these remnants of these wonderful structures and all this infrastructure all over the land that's still found to this day. It explains the great catacombs and all of the underground infrastructure that we can't really account for. Unless we're to believe that a group of people, especially within the United States, managed to construct rapid underground sewers and vast infrastructure in a very limited amount of time, and they managed to lay out many great cities and vastly increase their population, all within under 100 years. Of course, we've looked at other explanations for why in the current 5th era we seem to be unable to construct a very simple, small pyramid out of the same construction materials, or whether we're talking about one of the great many dome buildings, such as a national or state capitol that we have across the land, or whether you want to call it a capitol or a palace or whatever name we have for these current structures. We seem to have a lack of ability in constructing them, and it's one of the main components of evidence that we have that indicate that the accounts that we're given are not accurate. Of course, some people will say that just because you can reference something that's written down somewhere, it's incontrovertible proof. It is an incontrovertible fact that it must have happened. And it may be true. But it's very odd when you consider it and you apply a little critical thinking that certain things don't add up. Oftentimes, no one will ever bother to try to answer the logistics question behind all the wonderful structures that were constructed. And perhaps that's really where the concept of the last leader or the last emperor of Tartaria really comes into the final question. What were the last achievements of the previous civilization? What were the very last structures that they completed before their downfall? And oftentimes we think that it must have been the structures that we've looked at, the monasteries and the fortifications that we have, that were built as a last-ditch effort to try to preserve any bit of the civilization to make it to the next era. And perhaps it's because of those efforts that we even have any of the clues that we do to this day of the wonders that may have come in the past. Many people simply accept the fact that our civilization has always been on the ascendant, that there's only one civilization that's ever existed, that it goes from the evolution, if you will, of human beings from other forms of life, the changes in the development of intelligence, and as Carl Sagan liked to say, and then we just started to talk. And that was really the birth of our civilization. And you know what? It may all be true, but there's so many fallacies with it when we consider the critical thinking aspect. We have to be open to other possibilities. And it's one of the reasons why we've embarked on these explorations, because we have to search for explanations for what really came in the past. We have to really understand who we are. It's the greatest endeavor of human existence, because it's part of our journey, to look within and to understand who we are, and most importantly, who we have the potential to be. Because if we consider ourselves free of this corrupting influence that we always come across, this unfortunate focus on things that perhaps do not suit our best interest, then it could be possible that we could achieve the wonders that we had in the past. And maybe one day we could even have a civilization that exceeds those wonders, that we really could explore new areas and we really could develop ourselves from within. And who knows, maybe the real answer is perhaps something that transcends the physical realm. And oftentimes this blurs the line between spiritual and temporal affairs. And it's one of the main reasons why I'm not in the practice of telling people what to believe. I don't have to tell you what to believe. I respect the fact that you can believe whatever explanation is most fitting. Maybe you think Carl Sagan's explanation in terms of the history of the land is most fitting. Or maybe you believe in what you find in the Bible or any of the other holy works as the real explanation for how things came to be. I don't believe in discounting anything, because I believe that all the clues and all the evidence is scattered across anything and everywhere. And indeed that would make the most sense because of the fact that we have so much division that seems to be imposed within our current civilization. Now, whether this division is intentional or it's simply the unintentional consequences of the current arrangement of our society, we can certainly debate that. But we can't deny that it is very present. And we certainly can't deny that there seems to be many individuals who follow what appears to be a planned process, if you will, of depriving us of the ability of searching within. And perhaps that's the most compelling thing when we consider the account of the last emperor of Tartaria. And indeed we consider an entire civilization across the land that worked together. Now, oftentimes, people misquote me or misattribute the fact that I tried to suggest that this civilization was egalitarian. I don't think there was anything with egalitarian, at least in terms of how the people all existed. It just seemed to be that the civilization had achieved a balance by balancing both the needs of the individual with the needs of the society and the overall civilization itself. Imagine if you had a civilization that, instead of trying to conform individuals to fit in a box, actually catered to the strengths of the particular individual. What could you achieve? And if you actually had a civilization that focused on this and achieved spiritual awareness, in addition to the limitations of physical reality, then suddenly they could overcome those limitations. Suddenly, with a long enough timeline and a focus on both the artistic and the practical, you could achieve many of the great wonders that we see all around us. And if there was one individual who had found themselves directing this and had all this responsibility attributed to them, then perhaps it really showcased the fact that instead of achieving the balance, they had become unbalanced. And ultimately that led to the final downfall of Tartaria. It's all a very compelling account, and it's one of the reasons why I needed to consider the last emperor of Tartaria. We really needed to look at how this all could have come down with the leaders and what role they played. Were they able to preserve the elements of civilization, or has it all just simply been diminished to myth and legend, and that's all we have, with details that have been scattered, along with the final destruction? We have to take the hypothesis that it seems that the final destruction occurred much more abruptly than anyone at that time had any idea that it was going to happen. And indeed, if you think about the fact that all the records were completely destroyed, that there was a diaspora and a dysphoria that was inflicted on the population all across the land. The other thing that we aren't entirely sure on, but we have clues, is how exactly was the corrupted internal portion of the previous civilization responsible for the destruction of the people. And perhaps a destruction beyond just a physical death, but also the destruction of the society. Imagine if you have an entire society that wants to forget what had happened in the past, because in their mindset it was so terrible that they did not want to retain their own knowledge, that they willingly gave it up. And indeed, there have been a couple allusions to this, and whether you're looking at a fictional story or there's even historical accounts, where it seems as though the people willingly gave up the understanding of their own identity. It seems like it's something that goes against everything that we would expect people to value and believe. But we have to ask the question, is it something that came internally, or was it external? Did the people really reach a state of despair that they wanted to forget their past? Or was this just simply an approach that was imposed upon them? imposed upon them by corrupted leaders, the very leaders who had been corrupted by the forces that had attacked their civilization externally, and had now found the ultimate vulnerability. And perhaps that vulnerability stays with us to this day. These concepts of pride, of self-righteousness, or another way of saying it, the infuriating nature of righteousness. The idea that you're right and someone else is wrong, and that gives you the right to do anything to make those people see you're right. Perhaps that's something that we oftentimes overlook. And yet there's no shortage of depictions and illustrations that show us that this is indeed what had happened in the past. That there were groups of people who were turned against their fellow humans and were all too willing to engage in this open destruction. And what sort of forces of destruction did they really have at their hands for their disposal to tear down their own civilization? What sort of weapons did they have? And were these weapons limited to machinations, or were there biological weapons that we can't even begin to imagine? Indeed, if you step back far enough and you look at all the possibilities, and we do have evidence of what the civilization before achieved in terms of building its own infrastructure, then we also have to consider what sort of forces they had at their disposal to destroy that civilization. Now, it seems clear that there were some structures in some areas that were more susceptible to the destructive effects of these technologies, whether we're talking about frequency or sound technology, or perhaps even some sort of energy projection technology that we can't even begin to imagine. It approaches the realm of science fiction. And then, of course, there's all the methods of destruction that we have within science fiction and high fantasy accounts. Creatures, chimeras, and other strange hybrid creatures that have the ability of destruction within them. And once again, we'll be informed that this is all just simply product of wild imagination. It's all just a fiction. Yet these same people will also believe that people who simply had no greater technology than horses and carts and sailing ships managed to build these very impressive structures. They managed to build star forts and great cathedrals. They did so during a time when their civilization and their society was vastly uneducated, again according to the mainstream account, and also susceptible to various plagues. Now, is that what really happened? Or is that just simply what we're informed happened, and that what really happened was something far more devastating and far more calculated, far more concentrated with its destruction of the previous civilization? And don't forget what had happened to the people. And we always have that disturbing question. Did the people really understand what was happening? Did they want to forget their past? Or was it imposed upon them? The final account of the last emperor of Tartaria. Was this one single individual? We can certainly look at all the societies and all their respective cultural histories for the important individuals and leaders within their respective histories. We also have to attribute to the fact that looking at those histories, there is quite a fixation on the emperors and the great leaders who seem to make a difference. And whether we're talking about the East, the West, the North, the South, or any of these civilizations, we have no shortage of accounts of the achievements of their great leaders in the past. Indeed, the achievements which only seem to bring about a brief period in which some sort of unity was achieved. And of course, the recurring theme is that over time it eroded. Is that really just a microcosm for what we have at a larger scale when we look at the eras of civilization? It may be true. But there's nothing wrong with actually looking at the details and trying to come to a conclusion and understanding. Indeed, we're informed that the period of the Middle Ages, the knights and their concept of chivalry was not true, that it was a much darker time and that it only applied in certain cases. Yet we're also informed that during the Middle Ages it really wasn't that bad. There really weren't dark ages. Always interesting when they retract these accounts and walk them back. Perhaps one of the candidates for the last emperor of Tartaria could have been the account of the legendary Prester John. Did Prester John really exist? And does it warrant an exploration in and of itself? Looking at the official historical accounts of Prester John. Now, officially, the efforts to locate Prester John had failed because Prester John was just a myth. And all the efforts of the Portuguese and Spanish sailors and navigators to try to locate the kingdom of Prester John failed. or it was attributed to something else. But could there have been some sort of historiosity with this individual? Could this have been one of the last surviving leaders? And perhaps, we don't know the exact timeline, what sort of influence and capability did this individual have? And why exactly did this final enclave itself finally fall? These are all questions that we're going to consider in upcoming explorations. Because if we concern ourselves with who the last emperor of Tartaria was, perhaps it's not as important as who it was, in terms of what their final achievements did bring about. Because it seems clear that there was enough detail that survived that this concept was never really wiped away from the collective conscience of human beings. Now it seems as though there's only certain human beings that are even willing to consider it. And when there's others who tell you that you're not allowed to think certain things, or you're not allowed to even concern yourself with certain things, or that even by thinking or considering a possibility, you must have some sort of mental aberration, then you suddenly realize that it has nothing to do with the actual objective effects. It has everything to do with total control. And another example I'll give you is the Great Empire of the Dawn from the Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire series. And it was very similar to some of the accounts of the great legends of China with the legendary sage emperors, beginning with a great god emperor and then followed by others who succeeded them, with the Onyx Emperor, the Topaz Emperor, and the Amethyst Empress. And as time went on, these emperors had shorter lifespans. And then eventually, they were corrupted by the Bloodstone Emperor, an individual who brought about a near destruction and a complete destruction of the great Empire of the Dawn. Perhaps that's an analogy, a parallel for what may have happened in the past, where we either had a family or a series of individuals, and perhaps the last individuals who really cared about preserving civilization. Imagine that concept. Leaders who actually put the people that they were supposed to be in charge of before their own needs. We certainly like to say it in this current civilization, but we're rather hard-pressed to find actual examples of it really happening. Is it possible that there was a civilization where there was a leader that actually cared that much and really put the needs of the civilization before their own? Or is that simply a fiction, a fantasy? Is it really possible that there was one point in time where there was a leader that actually cared that much? Or was it just simply the product of high fantasy? And indeed, we often find this debate, this conflict, this internal and this external conflict in all realms of official history and fiction. But as always, I leave it to you. What are your thoughts? Was there a last emperor of Tartaria? Who was it? How effective were they? Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. The beauty and the grandeur of the Aurora Borealis, the atmospheric effect that we're told accompanied the Carrington event. The Carrington event was the dramatic and most powerful geomagnetic storm on record in 1859. So we have this account of our own planet generating a magnetic field that causes these elaborate light displays in the sky. But is there another explanation behind this effect that we see? What was the Carrington event? And why is it important to the old world?
Guards! Knights! Squires! Prepare for battle!
The Carrington event in 1859. We're going to explore the nature of the Carrington event and how it applies to the old world and our 5 eras theory on this channel. We start by examining what was the Carrington event, and in simple terms, it was a geomagnetic storm, a temporary disturbance of the Earth's magnetosphere caused by a solar wind shockwave. Observed by this individual, Richard Carrington, an amateur astronomer in the 1800s. You see, you don't need a professional astronomer to do these sort of things for you. This is the 1800s. And there's a lot of dramatic observations that came about with this Carrington event. The sky was stated to have been so lit up that people could read at night. There was also the fact that there were apparently devices that could register the disruption of the magnetic field. Isn't that an intriguing advancement for 1859? And we'll look into Richard Carrington a little bit later, but just looking at the observations that we have, we're informed that this was a very disruptive event. Of course, at that time, we didn't really have an electrical grid in place, although we did have telegraph, supposedly. In fact, we explored the establishment of the transatlantic cable earlier on this channel, and we're told that initially it worked, although very slowly in the 1850s, and they had to re-establish it in the 1860s using the SS Great Eastern. But back to the Carrington event, all these incredible displays in the sky and this disruption of the system were informed that the telegraph systems actually produced sparks, and that the operators could unplug their telegraph systems from their power sources, in 1859 mind you, and they were powered on their own by whatever this Carrington event really was. We're informed that should such a geomagnetic storm occur now, it would completely destroy our electrical grid. And here you can see the results of a transformer that was destroyed by potential disturbances. But you also look into the fact that this Carrington event seems to have been very dramatic, and the observation of sunspot activity, again by the amateur astronomer Richard Carrington, that gave indication that something was going on that was outside of the realm of normal observations. Now, of course, we still have the fear of a Carrington event occurring, and we always have the fear of a future geomagnetic storm. In fact, we're told that in the year 2025, we have a 2 to 3% of a geomagnetic storm occurring that matches the intensity of the so-called Carrington event. However, is that the reality, or are the percentages off? And we might recall that from 1959 to 1989, we lived through a time frame where we had a 97% chance of a nuclear war occurring. So make of it what you will with those numbers. I'm still intrigued by the fact, though, that we do have observations and data that indicate how intense the Carrington event really was, and that we actually had devices in 1859 that could measure the magnetic disturbances. And today, we can talk about possible defenses for a future geomagnetic storm, which I'm sure for the low price of whatever have you from certain contractors, you can actually implement countermeasures that would safeguard your electrical systems from a future geomagnetic storm. Naturally, it's the fear that accompanies what could happen if we have a geomagnetic storm completely destroying our electrical grid. I mean, where would we be without our internet? How would we receive our updates from the news? How would we know what to think about certain world events? It's quite a terrifying consideration. But this is what the official history tells us about the Carrington event, and this is the official scientific explanation that it represents this threat. Somehow we've been very fortunate that we've gotten through all these decades since the advent of electricity and the establishment of the overall electrical grid that we haven't had a geomagnetic storm that's disrupted it. But imagine the power behind this, that if there was a geomagnetic storm disrupting the electrical grid in the United States alone, and it affected no other nation, although we're told it would be a worldwide effect, what that would actually do to our current civilization. And indeed, that's the specter that looms over us about this geomagnetic storm. And of course, we have no shortage of diagrams and official scientific explanations from our now professional astronomers that'll tell us exactly how a geomagnetic storm and solar wind can affect our lives day to day. And as I said, fortunately, we haven't had this happen for, well, since 1859, oddly enough. And you can see how this Carrington event ties back into other explanations for what this may have been in regards to our examinations of the old world. But what can we document about the Carrington event from our official mainstream history? And I know that Howdy Mikowski attempted to verify references to the Carrington event within news sources from 1859. And I've done the same thing, and it's not exactly the easiest aspect to go about, looking at the periodicals that were available at the time. Now, supposedly there are a few articles, and of course I haven't seen the original papers, and I haven't actually seen the original documents that show that reference to this Carrington event appeared in 1859. And any references you do have just merely talk about the aurora borealis, which is quite a frequent event that occurs at all times, although we're told that it's more visible and more apparent when there's a larger solar storm, or a geomagnetic storm. We can even see certain different measurements given the devices that were available at the time in 1859. And so the official history tells us that the Carrington event was disruptive to the telegraph system, although given the fact that the civilization at the time was not dependent on electricity, although it did have a telegraph system and it did have devices that could measure magnetic disturbances apparently, it was merely an inconvenience at the time and the civilization moved on. and it certainly didn't stop news from being transmitted for current events at that time. But we're told to imagine what could happen if a Carrington event, or a very powerful geomagnetic storm that even, dare I say, exceeds the strength of the Carrington event, were to occur today, what that would do to our civilization. And it would be beyond simply disrupting telegraph machines or wondrous displays of beauty in the night sky, or nature's very own fireworks display. It is rather strange, though, that if this is a common occurrence, it didn't happen until 1859. And yet, any time of the year you can go out and oftentimes try to see the northern lights, or the aurora borealis. Richard Carrington's a very interesting individual as well, another one of these amateur astronomers from the 1800s, and it seems that everybody had an avocation that really filled the definition of secondary profession in the 1800s. Perhaps he was also capable of being a civil engineer and could build interstates. In fact, he was apparently an amateur architect who built his own observatory in Red Hill Observation, at least that's what we're told in this nice little drawing. And even in the drawing, we can see the signs of old world architecture behind it, as we typically encounter when we look at these observatories. And then we actually have the observations in the official publication from Richard Carrington that was printed, which includes a picture of his observatory from 1855. Indeed, many of the observatories that we see were allegedly established in the late 1700s through the 1800s, and we can see the signs of old world architecture within them. Now, does this allude to the fact that these observatories could have been structures with vastly different purposes, or was there some reason to require to observe the heavens at that time? When you look at the structures that still remain, this one in Northern Ireland, you can still see the grandeur behind them. And indeed, it seems as though these structures were built to last through all sorts of different events, even something as serious as the Carrington event. Although, from our understanding, the geomagnetic storm would only affect the electrical grid. It doesn't actually affect the structural integrity of buildings. Oddly enough, this whole concept of amateur astronomers building their own observatories is something that seems to have been quite prevalent in the 1800s. And we even look at how the 1800s ended with the establishment of the Yerkes Observatory in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. We've explored this before on the channel, and it's quite an impressive structure that was supposedly built in the 1890s, and it's even more interesting because of the fact that it actually has a relic from the Chicago World's Fair in it. And, of course, you're not going to build an observatory unless you have various adornments on the exterior of the building, such as the often seen griffin, because, you just can't have an observatory without many smiling griffins on the outside of it. It makes complete sense. Many odd images, though, that document the construction of this observatory, although the only thing you'll actually see pictures of being built is the dome on the top, and we know that observatory domes can be built, and oddly enough, this Yerkes Observatory title, University of Chicago, looks to be about the most, hasty thing that's done in the construction. And here is the telescope that's still in Yerkes Observatory to this day, featured prominently in the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. And again, this all relates back to the Carrington event because of the fact that telescopes were required to observe the heavens and allegedly observe the sunspots on the sun and other celestial events in the sky. And consider the fact that the telescope from the Chicago World's Fair did end up at Yerkes Observatory, and you can still go see it to this day with the building in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So many strange anomalies when we take this in totality, and we even consider the fact that this telescope was also one of the first to observe galaxies, if that's indeed what they are, in the distant cosmos. And no doubt, I'm sure Carl Sagan would be giving me a very big frowny face right now because of what I'm saying about observations. It may be as they tell us, or it may be something else entirely. We do have paintings and references to how beautiful the sky was during the Carrington event, and that's really one of the key indicators that we have about this with the aurora borealis, or the sky being lit. And perhaps there is some element of truth in the fact that we're told it comes from our celestial body's magnetic field that causes this Carrington event when the solar winds collide with it. Perhaps that's merely the scientific explanation for some other phenomenon that's actually occurring. And because of the fact that people see this dramatic aurora borealis, they have to have some way to explain it. Well, now that we've looked at the history of the Carrington event, let's consider if this was actually a reset event, going back to our 5 eras theory. And the Carrington event occurring in 1859 is at the end of our potential dates of when the reset may have occurred, or the last reset from the 4th to the 5th era. And there's no shortage of documentation that does indicate, regardless of which society or which culture you look at, that there were many celestial events in the sky that brought about a great change or a time of terrifying apocalypse. And this seems to be associated with what we would consider the vast visual display that accompanied the Carrington event. Did this really happen in 1859, or is it just the year that we think of as 1859? Was there some other terrifying, world-altering event that occurred? Because it seems that the effects of the Carrington event are something that we have in many apocalyptic accounts that precede the most terrifying of destruction. In other words, you have some sort of event that disrupts the entire society or the civilization, destroying its communication and aspects of its infrastructure before the true destruction follows. Is there real historicity within some of these mythical accounts that indicate that such a disruptive event occurred? And why is it for a lot of us that being put in the dark, so to speak, or losing our ability to communicate with other elements of our civilization or even our family and friends is such a terrifying psychological horror that we have to encounter? And then you also consider the fact that following this disruptive event, where communications are brought down, then the actual destruction follows. Is that alluding to something that had happened in the past with a particular reset event? We also consider the conflicting accounts that we have of population, the rapid population growth that occurred by official sources in the 1800s, the United States alone having its population increase by over 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. And then we also have many images of destruction. And yes, it is images of destruction from the 1800s, whether it's a city or even the arid nature of the landscape. Were we looking at the destroyed civilization? Do we have older accounts and older examples of previous civilizations? And indeed, the mainstream does tell us that many of the great remnants that we see across the land are from previous civilizations. Then suddenly this Carrington event becomes something that's even more terrifying, as it is the prelude, if you will, to an apocalyptic destruction. And perhaps it's all happened in the past, cyclically. Always on that cycle that we're told about in many different eras and many different ages. And when you look at the landscape, maybe you just see natural terrain, or maybe you see something that appears a little bit more artificial. Perhaps here in Shiprock, New Mexico, this is actually a wall, although that's extremely absurd to even suggest. We're told that it's merely the remnants of lava from an inactive volcano, even though it looks rather artificial. But come to your own conclusions about it. Starfish Prime. We examine the account of Starfish Prime. In the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union were testing nuclear weapons, and in the United States, this included testing nuclear weapons with high-altitude detonations. That was the very purpose behind the Starfish Prime nuclear test, where an over 1 megaton yield nuclear device, we're informed, was detonated in the atmosphere, put on top of a Thor rocket at that time, and fired up to a high altitude to test the effects of detonating a nuclear warhead in the high atmosphere. Well, it begs the question, why would anybody bother or care to test a nuclear detonation in the high atmosphere, or in space, as we're told, as they call it, but it's a high-altitude detonation, as is depicted here in this diagram. And so what are you trying to get from a high-altitude detonation of a nuclear warhead? Unless, perhaps, this was some other event. We're told they were detonated here, near the Hawaiian Islands, and yet the effects, or the aurora borealis from this detonation, was observed over 1,000 miles away. Indeed, this Starfish Prime detonation affected some of the electrical grid in Hawaii over 900 miles away. Now consider this, stepping back a little bit. Was this indeed a nuclear detonation that occurred at high altitude? Or was this some other event? Was this some other technology that was potentially being tested? Perhaps some remnants of old world technology that was utilized to disrupt communications in the electrical grid at previous times. When you consider the distance and how far away some of the effects of this detonation were observed, and the fact that it does bear more than a striking resemblance to the aurora borealis phenomenon, you have to question the fact that perhaps there is some technology available that may still induce this effect. this effect of this atmospheric change, or what we call the aurora borealis with the lights in the sky, and then disrupting the electrical grid, and perhaps having other disruptions on communications and basic living. Indeed, we're even told that the detonation of Starfish Prime left a residual radiation belt that affected several satellites, ultimately destroying their capacity to operate. Although whatever the reality behind satellites are, we also consider the effects on Hawaii itself, with car alarms going off and numerous grids being destroyed by the detonation of this nuclear weapon in the atmosphere. There was even a Thor rocket that exploded with a nuclear warhead on top of it. Fortunately, it did not create a nuclear detonation, and we have numerous examples of rockets that were armed with nuclear warheads exploding, but not causing nuclear detonations. So as always, make of it what you will. Apparently it was a minor inconvenience that delayed the tests, and they simply had to repair the site, and before 3 months they were back to shooting more rockets into space with nuclear warheads on them, trying to ascertain the results. There's also the psychological effect of a nuclear warhead producing an electromagnetic pulse that's featured in the films The Day After and Threads. Indeed, this is what precedes the main nuclear attack. So again, it reflects back to that psychological horror of having your communication system disrupted. And so what if the Carrington event is really just that? A much grander scale EMP weapon that was used in the distant past. An electromagnetic pulse that was used to bring down the grid of the previous civilization, that lowered their defenses. We think about how this resides in our psychological minds, in the fact that we still have the fear of this event occurring, and it was used to great paramounts when they were displaying the nuclear nightmare fear films of the early 1980s to us. Is this exactly what happened to the previous civilization? Were they the victims of some sort of electromagnetic pulse weapon, what we consider the Carrington event? It continues to live in our collective conscience. We have some sort of memory about it that we can't explain. And we know that this EMP, or these lit skies, preceded a terrifying event, the complete destruction of a civilization. Now, whether that destruction was done through kinetic energy weapons, cymatic weapons, or some combination of all of them, we don't know. But it is odd how we seem to have this memory. Or it could all be a coincidence. It could simply be that the Carrington event is as we're told, and that the history in the 1800s is exactly as we're told, with amateur astronomers and amateur everything achieving everything. And that's why we have all these churches that still remain. But what are your thoughts on the Carrington event? What do you think really could have happened? If we also consider the aspect of a mud flood, then we have to consider multiple causes, multiple weapons, and multiple events that were induced to actually destroy the civilization that came before us. And we always ask the question if these were natural or artificial events. Well, when we step back far enough, we have the terrifying indication that these may well have been artificially induced events. And by whom, you may ask? Well, whoever that enemy was that we were facing that we explored earlier this week in the account of the fall of the Fourth Era civilization, the final conflict. It would no doubt have taken many different means of destruction to unravel a unified civilization that was across the land. But those are the kind of considerations we have to take into account if we're going to accurately explain what happened. And maybe all the monasteries and even certain cities that we have that have wondrous surviving architecture that we can't explain. These were merely the civilization's remnants that were preserved over time, something that was meant to survive. And then as we came into our Fifth Era civilization, these structures, these monasteries, and now Capitol buildings were repurposed and still used to this day. But what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. Please join the channel this weekend on Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time for live stream exploring astounding architecture. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Sinkholes, those dramatic depressions that you can randomly encounter in the terrain across the land. We're informed by scientists that sinkholes can form gradually or abruptly, depending on the situation. How exactly do sinkholes connect with our exploration of these isolated ruins in elevated pieces of terrain? Could they be yet another indicator, a position of evidence that can show us that there was great artificial structures that occurred on a mega scale in the distant past, or perhaps the not so distant past? Have you encountered sinkholes in your travels across the land, and what's the real explanation for them? Join me today as we explore these heavenly pits. We begin by looking at the eponymous heavenly pit within China, deemed to be the largest sinkhole in the world. And if you have the means, I strongly suggest that you travel to China and tour this particular area. Although it's not necessarily for the faint-hearted, because it requires some incredible travel means and the ability to actually access this area. Nearly 1,700 feet wide and over 2,000 feet deep, with two separate bowls. And yet you can see that in this largest sinkhole in the land, there's an example of dramatic foliage that's at the bottom of it. What exactly does this really represent? And why do we tend to overlook sinkholes? And as I've said, you've likely encountered sinkholes in your travels. If you watch the local news wherever you are in the land, there's always a report of a sinkhole coming up in some area. Although it's certainly not as dramatic as this particular 1,700 foot wide sinkhole, it tends to simply be wide enough to swallow a single vehicle or two. But what's the real explanation behind these sinkholes, or this heavenly pit as they call it in China? We have many different scientific explanations behind it. It's some combination of processes including erosion and another one called suffusion, where we just randomly have liquid that seems to travel across the land, goes into underground areas, and causes the terrain to wash away. Of course, the scientific explanation is a little bit more complicated than that. But I can't help but wonder as we observe the dramatic areas wherever we are in the land that we tend to see the sign of some sort of architect in place. Now, of course, many people say that this is merely the natural shape of the land and that it occurred over natural processes, which of course include the processes of erosion and suffusion over a long period of time. Yet these same scientific conclusions also admit that sinkholes can form over a gradual period of time, months, years, decades, centuries, and yet there are some that can happen in a very short amount of time, quite abruptly, in fact, while your car is on top of it. But looking at some of the other images that we have of the very dramatic terrain in China, we can see similar features of terrain that we've seen in other portions of the land. These hexagonal-shaped blocks or pillars. Now, once again, we'll be assured that these are all natural terrain features. But why do they occur so frequently? Is this the process of lava, as some would have us believe? Or is it an indication of something else entirely? Some sort of advanced, older artificial construction process. A more advanced artificial construction process that was designed to be more in balance with the land. Well, ultimately, the conclusions are up for you to make. Of course, scientists, geologists will assure us that they know exactly how these processes occur, although it's interesting to think of processes occurring over hundreds or thousands of years with no one actually observing them, or no one even recording their observations, unless of course we're to believe that journalists were active in 200 BC and they were recording these very slow processes of erosion, and I suppose that could be possible. And of course the scrolls were preserved over this time. And while I'm being a little facetious on this is oftentimes what people will tell us to reassure us that everything that we know or think that we know about the land is to be easily understood. Now, in all seriousness, I don't want to dismiss the official scientific conclusions. I do believe that there is a lot of merit in what these observations are, but I'm merely reminding everyone that these are very recent observations, that if these processes do take a long period of time, how can we know the exact nature of them? But you'll find that there are numerous examples of evidence with sinkholes that they can suddenly occur very abruptly. And so what's really going on here when we look at these dramatic pieces of terrain in China? Could it be possible that we're looking upon very old ruins, that when we consider our 5 eras theory, the theory that we have where we have one civilization built on top of another, and I might add that current historians and scientists do corroborate that concept, where there are civilizations that are built on top of one another, that we have older cities, and the newer cities simply built on top of them. It's a rather intriguing premise when you think of all of our newer cities in the United States, and it's one of the reasons why I focus many exploration efforts on the United States, because official history tells us that most of the cities in the United States, especially the ones west of the Great Mississippi River, were all founded within the last 200 years, and many much more recently. Now, of course, in a place like China or in locations in Europe, we have that official history that says that there is a much longer period of time. How exactly were these very dramatic caves created in China? Well, they had a long period of time. People could have gone down there with their hammers and chisels and utilizing a forced labor concept, although we do have a very clear, or at least what we think is a clear picture of history in China, going all the way back to the legendary sage emperors of thousands of years ago, that indicates that this was possible, and that the civilization and the discipline of a civilization existed to construct these very clearly acknowledged artificial structures, whether they're above ground or below ground. And of course, there's still a lot about China that, while we think we know, perhaps we don't know. And I'm not saying that to be flippant or to be disrespectful to anyone from China. I think it's the same story that we have everywhere across the land. We have some officials, we have some forms of knowledge with scientists and geologists, and they give us their conclusions for how they believe these very dramatic landscapes formed, whether it's dramatic mountains or, in this particular case, sinkholes. I want to say that I appreciate the name of Heavenly Pit, though, for the largest sinkhole in the land that is located in China, at least the largest sinkhole that's actually acknowledged, because it does give us the indication that there's a possibility that there were previous layers to civilizations. I want you to really think about this as you look at this terrain here of China in this particular image. Could it be possible that what you're looking at is not necessarily an artificial formation? What if this is the remains of some sort of megastructure from a much earlier civilization? When you look at this particular sinkhole here, is that a possible theory? Is there some way that this could all be artificially constructed? And the reason why we have these very dramatic sinkholes don't have anything to do with erosion or suffusion. I mean, maybe they do, but maybe they have more to do with the fact that this was a artificial construct in a distant past, and with enough time that occurred and enough other natural processes of degradation that this entire structure eventually fell apart. And that's why you see this very dramatic opening, this sinkhole that's over 1,700 feet in width. And yet you have what appears to be this preserved area at the bottom of a sinkhole. I also have another theory about this. Could this also be an indication of some attempt of surviving or preserving elements of a civilization from an earlier reset? Really think about this, because on a smaller scale, we oftentimes have these structures that we refer to as kilns. They've been explored by other alternative explorers in recent years, myself and others included, to really try to understand how they were formed and what they were all about. Well, we understand that the kilns may well have been some smaller scale effort to preserve something of a previous civilization. They put their seeds, they put their crops, they put examples and maybe even information that they had recorded for the survivors of a reset to recover after this had occurred. Could it be possible then in the distant past, with larger scale civilizations, as we theorize on this channel, that existed, that this great sinkhole or these great sinkholes that exist in China really reflect that? When we observe these very dramatic and well-construed diagrams, we realize that there seems to be a lot more complexity to the subterranean component of our terrain than we like to believe. Now, it's always interesting to me, does the diagram accurately reflect what's really underground, or is it merely an impression? Of course, we're under the current impression or understanding that we have technology that can actually image this very accurately for us, although this is something that I vehemently question. I'm not saying that the technology is faulty in any way or that it's some sort of fabrication, merely that I don't expect anything to display perfection. because we oftentimes believe that our technology is perfect. But if our technology is perfect, then why do we have a slew of reports every single day from our media that we know always presents us a clear picture of what's going on across the land, that there tend to be issues with our technology? A near miss on an airport, or perhaps some sort of interpretation when it comes to one of our great self-driving cars having an issue. Of course, we understand it's new technology and it's not perfect. But I'm trying to reconcile this with our understanding of what we believe or understand to have believed really occurred in the distant past with the construction of these elaborate caves. Well, you have to give them credit in China because they're certainly making this a place to draw visitors to, even if it may not be the most accessible of locations, or even with the challenge of descending to the depths of these incredible sinkholes or these caves. And I think that's what's most interesting to me is we have the sites that we know about, or at least the sites that are published. But are there other sites that we don't know about in remote areas of the land? Is it possible that there may be a great sinkhole or heavenly pit that could be under your feet that just simply hasn't formed yet? Now, I certainly don't mean to alarm anybody, and we are reassured by our individuals in authority that things are safe, but you certainly have seen numerous news reports about random sinkholes forming, especially in roadways, that tend to swallow up a car or two. Fortunately, they don't tend to be over 2,000 feet deep, and therefore you won't take the terminal velocity drop. It'll only be a few feet, and then with some recovery assets, and as long as you keep your wits about you, you'll tend to be fine, although your car probably won't. But I'm really thinking about this overall impression that we have of these mega structures, and even looking at some artistic impressions of what these could really be, and understanding the fact that what if there was some sort of effort in the distant past, or maybe even the not so distant past, where we had a civilization that possessed the implements of technology to shape the land itself, or maybe even integrate the land within its very structures. Now, once again, this does, of course, seem like science fiction, but of course we oftentimes have that explanation about our current technology level. But is that really what's going on? Or is it merely an attempt to generate understanding for that which we don't have understanding yet? And maybe that's why it's important that we examine this concept of sinkholes. And they're all over the land. They're certainly not just sinkholes in China. They're in the United States, they're in Russia, they're in Europe. You can find them everywhere. I think back to our earlier exploration of the Great Lakes and the many different rumors and legends that we have that are affiliated with the Great Lakes. And it's interesting to note that in the certain bay areas, here we're looking at Thunder Bay, and we have a report of numerous different sinkholes and even an understanding of formations. How interesting with the unique history of the Great Lakes, where we have legends and myths of the lakes not even existing there. Is it possible then that these lakes may have formed through some other theory that we can't even begin to imagine? Yes, I know, we have our official scientific conclusion that the Great Lakes were formed by the wondrous glaciers. And again, through that process of erosion and so on and so forth, they formed gradually over a period of time. And that may be exactly what happened. But we still have to consider the accounts that we have, other maps, and other statements that indicate that something else happened. Now, you're more familiar with the smaller sinkholes, and these are the kind that we seem to encounter across the land. Is it possible, though, another theory concerning these heavenly pits, that perhaps they're formed through a different means, some older technology, an older apparatus that may still be active somewhere, in some undisclosed or perhaps undiscovered portion of the land, that's still emanating the process of this technology, that causes the abrupt formation of any sort of depression or sinkhole? It's interesting to think how we always seem to have the exact same scientific process that applies in every single situation. It's also worth noting that there are these great pits that occur underwater, and these are perhaps some of the most dramatic ones that you can hope to encounter. And if this does occur underwater and above the surface in varying levels of size. Now, it's also interesting to note that if you look up the scientific definition and understanding of a sinkhole, you'll find that they can occur in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. The largest that we know of being the one in China, nearly 1,700 feet in width and over 2,000 feet in depth. But there are other sinkholes across the land that are over hundreds of feet across. And how deep do they really go? It's a very dramatic conclusion, though, to think that it could be some sort of technology that's still operational out there that may be randomly forming these traumatic depressions within the terrain. If you're a farmer, it's certainly going to catch your attention if half your field has just suddenly disappeared right beneath your feet. Imagine the damage that it could cause to your equipment. And we'll take a look at an example of some of these dramatic and abrupt sinkholes that do form in some of our cities all across the land. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you believe that these sinkholes are formed by these understood processes that we have, that we understand exactly how this happens, and there's really no reason to be concerned about it or even have awareness of it, as we're oftentimes given the understanding that our awareness is very, very limited in terms of not knowing the scientific processes? But be assured there are other people who are studying these processes and they understand exactly what's happening. And that's why you shouldn't concern yourself with sinkholes. Yes, there's the possibility that they may form anywhere, at any place in time. They can be on the surface of the land, they can be underwater, and we really shouldn't be that concerned about it. But when taken with the holistic view of our understanding that there are very dramatic, elevated pieces of terrain out there, oftentimes we think of these elaborate bluffs or even mountains as being naturally formed. And we have the conclusion in our mind that they must have been naturally formed. And yet when you look at many of them, they have the signs of being artificially constructed. Now, of course, someone will try to say, you're just simply imagining it. You're seeing things in your mind. And I could understand how in some situations that may be true. But we've looked at far too many examples of precise symmetrical construction and geometric precision on a scale that we can't even begin to imagine. And we see similar signs at all scales, whether it's just a few meters to a couple thousand meters, that they just happen to look exactly the same. The Great Blue Hole, another example of one of these sinkholes where it's in the water. Did it form with the exact same process? Or again, was it something else that occurred? Something that occurred in the past, or perhaps the more recent past than we like to think? Now, something else I want you to consider when you think of the concept of the terrain, whether it's on the surface or beneath the water, just abruptly disappearing and going down into a deep depression in a very short amount of time. If it is the result of some older piece of technology that may still be active somewhere, does anybody have any idea what the effects of this could really be? Where could it be located, and what sort of yield is it going to produce every single year? For example, if you had some sort of apparatus that gave you the ability to change the actual nature and composition of the soil. Really think about that. Really think about what that could actually mean if a previous civilization had possessed that sort of technology. Suddenly we have a very viable explanation, albeit in theory, for the formation of many of these incredible structures. And also think about some of the other unexplained, or at least very difficult to explain, origin that we have. Even for many of our simple towns and cities across the United States, and I'm just using the United States as an example, it certainly applies in other locations such as Australia or anywhere else that our official history tells us was settled, mostly since 1850 and beyond, where we have these towns that have very unique subterranean components to them. I'm thinking of just any small town in Midwest United States or even the Great Plains where they have a very extensive sewer system. Are we to really just believe that it was horses and some plows and some very determined settlers that decided to lay out and found their towns? Or is it possible that there was remnants or perhaps some sort of control of a previous technology from even a previous civilization to the one that preceded ours that had the means to actually form these subterranean components to their cities and their towns? And that's how we can explain this. And remember, if the concept of having cities built on top of previous cities, then what do you really have? Think about some of the areas that we have with these giant bluffs that we've looked at. Now, this tends to be the more unique and current concept that we have of a sinkhole. We don't think of the very large and dramatic ones, but we think of the smaller ones that can occur in roads, and oftentimes in our minds we'll simply affiliate that with the complete washout of terrain. There was a lot of rain, there was a lot of abrupt erosion, it was a minor landslide, and that's how we'll explain a lot of this away. Or at least that's what we'll think in our minds. Now, it's true there are situations where that may apply, but I think the fact that we overlook the dramatic size and, of course, the composition and disposition of these sinkholes, that we have to consider that they may be reflecting something else in reality. Something that, once again, we just don't talk about, and we either talk around or we understand that there is a official explanation, and there's really no reason for us to concern ourselves with the exploration, at least in thought, of these dramatic pieces of terrain that just abruptly form. Now, looking at this particular sinkhole, do you think this is something that formed abruptly or gradually over a period of time? I mean, you can certainly look at it and come to your own conclusion. And again, what scientists will tell us is that sinkholes tend to form in a diameter pattern, or a circular pattern with a diameter and a radius to them. Although, do they in every single occasion? Or are there different dimensions to sinkholes that could be the result of something else? Oftentimes, looking at these, I find myself struggling to accept the official processes for how these sinkholes may have formed. Yes, it was just a lot of water that managed to infiltrate in this one particular area, and it washed away or it changed the very composition of the soil under the surface, and that is how this very dramatic depression formed in a very short amount of time. Yet, I find myself questioning the conclusion behind this, because of the fact that when you look at the evidence available, and as I said, you can certainly find one of the sinkholes that's in your own particular area, whether it's one of the large dramatic ones, such as pictured here, or even one of the very small ones that can abruptly occur in your street, such as in the great city of Omaha, where there's been reports of sinkholes occurring recently in the United States. What's really the nature behind them? How exactly do they form? And what could they possibly represent? It's not saying that we know exactly what the conclusion is, but it's something that we can explore and come up with our own explanations for in terms of theories. Because I'm not accepting the confident prediction that we have for how these formed and how these may form in the future. And here we go to the great city of Omaha in the Exarban district, when very recent, just a few weeks ago, where there was a collapse or a sinkhole that dramatically swallowed 2 vehicles. And of course it was featured on international news in terms of an example for how rapidly a small sinkhole can form. Now, this particular situation was something that happened in a very brief amount of time. You can find the dramatic video that shows how abruptly this happened. Now, remember that we have explored the Omaha area before. Omaha, Nebraska, just west of the Missouri River. And there's a lot of different interesting anomalies or coincidences when we consider the city. Now, this particular area that this occurred in, it's near the university. Exarban, the district that it occurred in, has quite a historical identity to it. And yet they paved a road where this very dramatic event occurred. A sinkhole forming that swallowed up 2 vehicles. Fortunately, first responders were on hand and the occupants of the vehicles were unharmed. And once the police responded, they were able to recover the vehicles from this dramatic sinkhole that abruptly formed. But really think about the timeline on how this formed. And as I said, you can look up the video and see exactly how these vehicles were very quickly swallowed by this sinkhole that just abruptly formed. Now, we can certainly look for other explanations behind this. Perhaps when they constructed these old historical streets in Omaha, there were just simply some pieces of terrain that were not exactly stable. But remember that in every city, including Omaha, we have the understanding that it was built on layers over a period of time. So if that's really the explanation that we have, how exactly would an old historical street anywhere, whether it's Farnham Street, Douglas Street, Dodge Street, or 10th Street, or any of the other famous streets in Omaha, have this capacity to just abruptly vanish in a sinkhole? How exactly did it happen? And going back to the explanation of Omaha, we do understand that in the official history, we have all the signs of old world indicators with the city of Omaha. from its very founding after 1850. And then, of course, the great expositions that occurred, followed by regrading and other dramatic events. And it should be noted there's been numerous reports of sinkholes across Omaha in recent times over the past 2 years. Now, I'm not picking on Omaha. I mean, you can watch your local news wherever you are in the land, and you'll have some report of a sinkhole occurring very dramatically and what efforts the authorities and the local government are doing to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Although it should be noted that Omaha has had a recent report of numerous sinkholes occurring, mostly in the streets, and some of the locals, when I spoke to them, said that they were a little distressed about this. I mean, just imagine a garbage truck suddenly going right into a sinkhole, a couple of passenger vehicles being swallowed up near a university. It sort of has a way of getting people's attention, doesn't it? I mean, think about it. You're driving around in your car and you're just sitting at a stoplight, and the next thing you know, the earth is falling below you and you feel that sinking feeling in your stomach. And of course, some of the denizens of Omaha are just a little distressed about this. We filed reports, made a scene, still no help. I mean, can you really blame local politicians, especially if this is a very old city or this is a city that's been built on top of the remains of other cities? I mean, look at this old world building that we have in the background here. And as I said, we've explored Omaha in detail before. We know that expositions occurred here. Now, of course, the official explanation is that all of these structures you're looking at in this dramatic image were all temporary structures. Although the question I've always had is, if we could build temporary structures like this so easily in 1898, why don't we still do this today? I mean, imagine the draw that you could have in a great exposition or fair if you could build dramatic temporary structures such as this. But again, the official explanation was in 1898 they could build temporary structures. Here in Omaha, they could rapidly tear them down and remove them. So very easy logistical processes that were occurred long before the advent of the U.S. interstate or even the highway system. Also recall that in our exploration of Omaha, we do have an official historical account of regrading. Yes, regrading, that dramatic process where they removed entire hills. And that's why we have these very dramatic images that show us these buildings that are isolated on what appear to be very artificial bluffs. It's a very strange set of images, isn't it? And we certainly have our other reports of regrading, such as in nearby Kansas City and all the way out in Seattle. And yet this was done at a time, again, before the advent of the U.S. highway system even, primarily in the 1920s, where these incredible logistic achievements were pulled off, despite all the limitations at the time. So again, it's painting a very different picture from what our understanding of history may be. But it goes back to the basic question. What do you think sinkholes are? How exactly do they form? Why are they so dramatic? And why do they occur everywhere? Going back to the whole concept of the mud flood as we understand it, remember that it's just a theory. But one of the central ideas that we explored behind the theory of the mud flood was some other sort of technology that may have caused it. Now, are you seeing any sort of excavation project occur on this scale today in any city anywhere in the land? Well, let me know in the comments if you think you are. I look forward to addressing them. But it's intriguing looking at these early, or at least stated to be early historical images of Omaha, where we see all this foliage and these very rudimentary dirt roads. This was our logistical access that existed that enabled the people of the time, utilizing temporary materials of course, to build these very dramatic and elaborate structures. And I think this is one of the issues that we see with the concept of thought and exploration today. Oftentimes we understand that we are supposed to be limited in our duration of attention. Here looking at St. Cecilia's, for example. St. Cecilia, that very impressive church from the early 1900s or early 20th century that stands today still in Omaha. And if you look at the details, you'll notice that it has many details that were present in temporary structures, built at the other expositions and world fairs contemporaneously, as its stated construction date. And yet, this is most certainly not a temporary structure. It stands to this day. And yet it almost looks like it's some sort of remnant from an exposition. And yet we understand it to be very different, and even at a different location. And by the way, St. Cecilia's is really not that far geographically from where that dramatic sinkhole occurred in the Exarban district. But how exactly does it compare with these temporary structures that were just quickly thrown up, and then just as quickly demolished and discarded in Omaha in 1898. And recall that they did all this with that very rudimentary series of dirt roads and a few railroad tracks. Yes, that's what some people would have you believe. Well, there were railroad tracks and there were dirt roads, and that was all they needed to build all these elaborate structures. Now, of course, we have a highway system, we have more railroads than we did, and we have more advanced processes. Oh, and let's not forget that we also have computers. And we now have computers with even more advanced software. We have artificial intelligence available. We should be able to easily overcome these challenges that were faced in 1898. Why aren't we building like this? Why aren't we doing excavation projects like this all across the land? Why aren't we founding more towns and cities? Certainly we have the space, especially in places such as the United States, where we could establish more towns and cities all across the Great Plains. Perhaps there's always an explanation, though, that we'll accept. It's merely because it's prohibitive costs. And yet our understanding is that we had the exact same economic system in the United States when these dramatic regrading projects were done, and somehow the money was available to do all of this, even though there wasn't a Federal Reserve available at the time. In other words, deficit spending wasn't quite as encouraged. But at the end of the day, it's up to you to decide what to think. Now I ask you to join me for looking at our history of Omaha, if you're interested. Omaha, somewhere in Middle America. What if I were to tell you there was a location where we had evidence of everything that we've talked about with the old world? Expositions, mud flood, and even evidence that continues to this day. What if there's one location where it all came together? In today's exploration, we explore Mud Flood, Ground Zero. Omaha, Nebraska, founded 1854, the original territorial capital of Nebraska, until it was moved further west with, well, the construction of nicer state capitals in Lincoln, so the official history says. And we can see the city didn't start out with all that much, although this was right during the time of the American Civil War. And we see elaborate structures on a hill, but perhaps nothing too surprising in this image. Although, is this a photograph? Is this a drawing? Is this some kind of rendition of a photograph and a drawing? Why are we returning to Omaha for a closer little look, so to speak? I'm not exactly sure what the intention of this image was. But we do know that in Omaha in 1898, the Trans-Mississippi and International Exposition occurred. The population fluctuations of Omaha are quite intriguing when we look at them. How the city abruptly grew, especially from 1880 to 1890, according to official records. Then they had this incredible exposition, and then in 1900, after the exposition, the population seemed to decline quite abruptly, and then it slowly grew for the rest of the 20th century. Why an exposition here, though? The Trans-Mississippi Exposition was to recognize all the productivity and the expansion of the United States west of the Mississippi. So why wasn't it held in St. Louis? Well, of course, because there was going to be a World's Fair in St. Louis just a few short years later. This was Omaha's turn. Why did somebody select Omaha? Well, the city apparently needed to be highlighted. Now, we've looked at all the historical explanations behind these expositions, and something I'll share with you, being someone who worked quite closely in the history department of numerous universities, I was always taken aback in the 20th century how no one really shined a lot of attention on these expositions. Oh, they were known about and discussed, but they were certainly not highlighted as any sort of watershed events in history. They were just that, fairs. And we have fairs everywhere all the time, all over the land to this day, to include the famous Iowa State Fair. I just figured I'd bring that up since Nebraska and Iowa are always so closely related, and sometimes they are not. So what was the real intention behind this exposition? Was this just to showcase the City Beautiful movement? Another interesting detail is that this particular World's Fair, or exposition, or whatever term we have for it, highlighted the presence of Native American tribes. Yes, this was after the official end of the Plains Indian Wars, or whatever we were calling that conflict, although it was also the official end of centuries of conflict between the settlers and the Native Americans, again according to the official history. But I want you to look at this exposition in Omaha with a different perspective. What if this was not an exposition in the way that we think of it as being? What if this was actually some sort of orientation event for a population recently coming off a diaspora, people who were returning to inhabit and settle the land? Looking at the official history of Omaha, it doesn't exactly make a lot of sense why anybody would want to hold any sort of exposition here, and then build all of these, as we understand them to be, temporary structures. It just never ceases to amaze me, the incredible temporary structures we were capable of constructing between 1890 and 1910. And then, of course, as you look at the official history, it seems as though our abilities to construct with stucco, plaster, balsa wood, popsicle sticks, it seemed to decline, especially by the 1930s. Now, who knows if that's exactly what happened? I'm merely saying that's what the images tend to convey. And we know that we certainly can't trust images. Could we ever fully trust images? Perhaps not. But they do provide clues. And the clues that we do have from these images is that this exposition was a very incredible and involved affair. Numerous structures being constructed, and you would think that the good people of Nebraska, having just come off the Columbian Exposition in Chicago just a few short years earlier, would not be so keen to have an exposition or visit it. But yet, here we are. But what if that's exactly what this was? The reason that we have all these expositions, these World's Fairs, is they were set up to actually be orientation events. They were to be the foundation, the nexus of the new civilization. You go to this exposition, and this is where you receive your orientation. This is the history of the land that you are now settling, and this is the role that you're going to play in the land. And these are going to be the conflicts in the future that you will engage in this land. This will be your entire society. And it also includes some events for fun, such as sliding down the big slide. I only included this because we tend not to see these kind of events with World's Fairs, but yet at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, it seemed as though fun was at least on the itinerary a little bit. And certainly you would expect that to be the main event with fairs. Ah, yes. And whatever happened to our big, tall, grand slides? Well, most of them were removed at the end of the 20th century because they were deemed unsafe. But there have been many other explorers that have done fine analysis on the images from these World's Fairs, and there tend to be a lot of questions. Of course, some of those questions could be answered, understanding that these photographs have gone through many chains of custody, they've existed in many different published books. But why does it seem that some of these structures, well, they just appear a little bit more permanent than we're initially led to believe? How would any of these structures remain standing in the winds of Chicago or the winds of Omaha in the Missouri River Valley? And there's also a curious set of hills that are nearby. We've led into the concept of mud flood, or the existence of an incredible amount of terrain and soil that covered and buried structures from a previous civilization. Now, many oftentimes deride the theory by either ignoring observations or simply not taking the images at face value. And I will concede if images are not to be taken at face value, then it would also state that images that do act against proving the theory are also to be negated. So I suppose at the end of the day, it really just matters what your personal assessment is. But the clues that we have is that these structures did in fact exist, and they were quite lavish and beautiful, and very well decorated and designed. And these images still exist in numerous historical societies, not just the Nebraska State Historical Society, and the nearby Durham Museum, which is located in Omaha to this day, which preserves a lot of these images. What a lovely triumphal arch. Although we do have examples of triumphal arches that were apparently temporary structures, were they? Why was it the United States was still reflecting the ideals of classic Rome, even in the late 1890s, at what was supposed to be an exposition? I wonder if we're going to get a triumphal arch at the upcoming fair in Des Moines this next year. The incubator babies. Yes. When we explored this before, we didn't discuss the fact that there was yet another incubator baby exhibit in Omaha at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. Why would there be an incubator baby exhibit even before Coney Island? What was this all really about? Well, if we step far enough back and go with our theories, it seems to lend credence to the fact that this exposition, this Trans-Mississippi exposition, was really about something very different. The concept of how we either enabled infants to survive, or perhaps it was some other form of technology being used to bring about an entirely new type of human being. We don't know for sure. There are many different theories. But going off the official history, who would actually want to go to yet another exposition affair to see a bunch of incubator babies? Unless this is something that actually represented what these people were informed of was the hope, the dream for a prosperous civilization that they were to be the first settlers of. That these structures represented something that they were to venerate and remember, and yet also be destroyed. Because one of the prime movements going on was the so-called City Beautiful movement, something that came out of the Chicago World's Fair in the earlier 1890s. And yet we see these impressive structures. And let me know in the comments, do you think this particular structure was something that was built from the ground up just to be temporary? That this is stucco, this is wood, this is plaster? Or are these legitimate columns? Is this some kind of marble and concrete? Or is it some mixture of all the above? How does any of this make sense? How would a structure like this endure for people to walk in and about if it was subjected to the forces of local weather, the wind? What is the truth behind these incredible arches? Not just these arches here in the Trans-Mississippi Exposition, but all the other so-called temporary arches that we've seen across the United States in the very early portion of the 20th century. Some even being constructed to commemorate the return of the World War I veterans of the United States. It paints many conflicting and contrasting images and possible stories. It gets even more complicated when we try to reconcile the explanation of these unique images, these icons that we've seen in these old world structures. Now I know what you're going to be saying or thinking. Well, these structures are all gone. Whether they were temporary or permanent, it's irrelevant, because these structures have all been torn down. Nothing of them remains. Have they all been torn down? Has every single structure been accounted for? Was this particular exposition destroyed? Every single one of these structures brought down with no remains, no evidence? Or is there a very slight possibility, a very slim chance that the reality is many of these structures are still around in Omaha, to be explored to this very day? That they've merely been amalgamated, integrated into the new city. It's a continuing mystery that we have, but it's something I wanted to take a look at, because we do have the official historical account that the expo grounds were demolished, circa November 1899. Yes, probably one of the most effective uses of the word circa I've ever heard. And you can see the rather odd images that we have of destruction of the great structures of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha. But again, going back to that question, if they were just all temporary structures, then how is it that there are so many signs that they were not, that they seem to endure? And this particular image, what year is this from? You could think that perhaps this is from the 1890s, anywhere up to the 1930s. This particular image is attributed to the 1930s, but if you didn't know that, what exact year would it be from? That's always the difficulty when you're going through archives. And again, I'm not suggesting there's any sort of intentional effort to mislabel the dates on images, just that something like that could occur. There are problems with everything. The Douglas County Courthouse. A very impressive edifice, and yet again, another story that we've heard, and a repeated story. Not officially part of the Trans-Mississippi Exposition, but a very impressive structure. And you may recall that one of the main reasons that we have so much interest in Omaha is the fact that it contains another one of the story beats, if you will, of an old world city. Not only do we have an exposition in Omaha, we also have an account of regrading. In other words, they had to completely level the great hills that the city was built on. And naturally, they did this after these structures were already constructed. This is what the official history tells us. And this is why we have these rather odd images of houses that are standing up on piles of wood and large mounds of dirt, I suppose, that are around these very elaborately constructed structures. Or, once again, like with the exposition, could there be another explanation? Is it possible that what we're really looking at are the early survey and settling images of Omaha? That this was the initial look at the city to identify what was what and what structures were where and what efforts would need to be undertaken to effectively salvage the city. Because if you look in Omaha, you'll see there's St. Cecilia's Cathedral, officially built in 1905. And you may recall that we've looked at cathedrals like this in other nearby cities, such as Sioux Falls and St. Paul up in Minnesota, Sioux Falls in South Dakota. And we've seen these incredibly elaborate cathedrals constructed over a period of time. This is officially a Catholic cathedral, but I ask you, do these look like the symbols of Catholicism? These incredible obelisks that seem to be integrated to the walls with spears on the top of them? And then, of course, we have our favorite large cartouche around the window. And yet we see other symbols that we may not traditionally associate with Catholicism. I know, anything Roman, well, it's Roman Catholic, right? It's in the name. Perhaps so. But looking at this impressive structure in person, it really gives you an appreciation for what it was really all about. Is anybody going to build a cathedral like this in Omaha, New York City, Des Moines, any city anywhere in the land? Some people will argue that yes, that we will, but we don't really see it happening. And it should be noted that this cathedral has the same story that the others do. That it was initially constructed in 1905, but it took years to finish. That they held the first services in the 19-teens before it was completed. These very, very impressive columns that are all single-piece columns. And these blocks. What exact materials is this particular structure made out of? Yes, you can look it up. Combination of limestone and granite, or some form of concrete. And yet examination, we can see that there appears to have been damages to these stones over time. What exactly caused these damages? And to be honest with you, I strongly suggest if you have the means to visit structures like these in person. It's one thing to look at all of the images, which of course we know can be modified, as opposed to really going there in person and appreciating the scale of the structure. And look at the detail. What exactly do these symbols represent? What are these devices here on the side of this cathedral? Why are they necessary? If this was just a cathedral that was being constructed to provide Catholic services and a show of piety to a relatively new population, then what purpose did they serve? We don't really have much in the way of construction photos of this particular cathedral. Yes, I know you can do searches and maybe you'll find something else, but it is intriguing to see that this was the lone structure in the area, and then the rest of the neighborhood was built around it. But what's the real explanation behind it? Was it founded in this condition and then augmented and repaired, or did it exist in some other condition? What are your thoughts? And we go to St. Mary Magdalene Church, built 1903, top to bottom, after 1920. And I consider this mud flood evidence structure number 1. This structure still stands to this day. Officially as part of the regrading program that occurred in Omaha in the 1920s, they ended up building the existing floor below the church. They actually have the temerity to tell us that. And here is a picture of the church before they started this regrading and actually built it top to bottom. Now, what do I mean by they have the temerity to tell us that? That's quite a bold explanation. If that's what history said happened, then it happened. If we really had the capability to do this, and if we really had the capability to do this in 1920, then what really stopped us from doing anything? And what was really the purpose behind this regrading? Official historical accounts inform us that the issue in Omaha was that the streetcars couldn't actually ascend the incline, and that's what prompted this regrading. Of course, if you walk on this street today, which you can very easily do, and visit St. Mary Magdalene, you'll notice that the hills are still present. Ah, yes, we always have the individuals with their fancy hats watching the proceedings and the work. Is that what's really going on? Were they really regrading the hills? Or were they removing an existing layer of dirt, debris? Now, yes, we say mud flood and we have theories for what happened, and maybe we don't know. Maybe there really was just an incredible landslide that overtook the land of the entire Great Plains. Or maybe there was something else. However, simply taking the construction account of this impressive structure at face value is, well, problematic at best. And the reason being is that if you actually go and explore this structure and the nearby Central High School, which we'll also take a look at, you'll find that there are a number of anomalies with this area. The fact is that the impressive and steep incline on the hill still exists. So was this regrading project really done just to make things easier for the streetcar or the trolley or all the other names that we have for it? I always appreciate the fact that people think that they know the exact name for something, and yet they don't recognize the fact that there are different names and different pronunciations simply as a means to make sure that people can easily identify what regional area or city that you come from. But that tends to slip most people's mind. And here we have it, the slant construction. Here's something else that's interesting. The means in which this excavation was carried out, or this regrading. Now, whatever was happening, there had to be some kind of technological implements available in order to remove this dirt. And make no mistakes about it, the official historical account and our mud flood theory agree that a lot of dirt was removed or excavated. The only thing that's different is the why behind it. But we know that the dirt was removed from the area. But it didn't change the slope on the hill. It did not really change anything with the layout of the city. What it did do, apparently, is it required a very bizarre set of circumstances that continued for a lot of these buildings, especially for this Mary Magdalene church. It required that a church that had been constructed at the beginning of the 20th century had to have a new level built underneath it. Now, how exactly does this make any sense? How would this even be possible to build this particular structure? Now you're probably asking, why are we looking at this again? Because I felt that it was something worthwhile to cover and even look at the evidence a little bit more closely in terms of what we have. A lot of the evidence seems to indicate that far from constructing this church from top to bottom, what we actually have depicted in the images is merely clearing out and cleaning off the lower floors that were already in existence. It's really hard to determine exactly what's going on, as it always tends to be in these construction images. But when you look at this particular image, what exactly do you think it's telling us? Here we see what appears to be the excavator of the time available, removing dirt. And yet the area that it's removing the dirt from around the church, we can see very clearly that there is a structure in existence. Were there individuals that were actually going in and putting in these bricks, building from top to bottom, as the official historical account tells us? Or was the structure already in existence? And as the dirt and mud, or whatever you want to call it, was cleared away, it simply needed to be constructed and filled in. And that's what we really have going on in these images. The truth of the matter is, I don't know. But the images that we have do seem to give the indication that the structure was already there. That the dirt was removed, it was cleaned, it was repaired, and it was pressed back into service. This lower level that had been buried for all this time. Because I'm not really accepting the fact that if a regrading project was occurring, just for the sake of the streetcar or the trolley, then why was that the focus? I thought it'd also include these interior images that we have of how the church originally appeared before the regrading project on the interior. And it's a very simple and direct layout, and it makes sense. And we don't see anything that we wouldn't expect to see. But we do have other images that show us what the church looked like after the regrading occurred. And we have what looks to be a pit area that was dug out. Well, why bother at this point? Why not just leave the church layout the same way that it was? And then you could establish your little basement area, if it was built top to bottom, for your coffee and rolls area. Yes, I'm well aware that tends to be how Catholic services go. You do Mass on Sunday, and then afterwards you just go downstairs for coffee and rolls. But for some reason, as if to make this church appear more elaborate, they decided to build it from top to bottom, and then move the pews below for reasons unknown. Why do that, if that's what indeed happened? Or is the true story the fact that they actually cleared this out and restored this church to its original architectural layout? This is one of the most direct examples of evidence that we've examined that supports the mud flood. It's all in the city of Omaha. An exposition, accounts of impressive structures surrounded by dirt, an official historical account informing us that the hills had to be regraded because the streetcars required a smaller degree of slope. And yet, when you look at the images of the hills and compare them with the current layout of the hills, it doesn't seem to have changed. Yes, you do have this picture that shows a different color of brick. What's this structure look like today? Well, I went out and took a look, and when you go from the bottom, remember that was constructed most recently, as opposed to the top, well, to the naked eye, there doesn't appear to be that much of a difference. The bricks all appear to be exactly the same. Now, yes, it's true there could have been other renovations that were no doubt carried out on this church, but when you go up and actually assess the materials, the bricks, they look exactly the same, regardless of what particular section of the church that we're talking about. Yes, we're only talking about a 20-year difference, although the construction of the lower portion of the church is rather difficult to detail. And then this interesting expansion. So, who knows for sure? Is it possible that the church was built top to bottom? It's possible. But I think it's more probable that that foundation support was already there. And here you can see the existing hill. Not too much different than the hill before the so-called regrading project occurred, and the many modern buildings. Nearby Central High School, another puzzling and anomalous structure. Another one of these very wondrous high schools that also involved a subsequent addition, digging into the hill, and many other structures in Omaha. Some clearly of our civilization, and others giving the impression of an older civilization, or at least someone who seemed to appreciate more art and beauty in their architecture. St. Mary Magdalene, Mud Flood Building Number 1. You can go look at it for yourself and come to your own conclusions. And I think that's one of the most impressive things about the city of Omaha. There is still so much evidence from the past. And even the story of Central High School. Here looking at the church that we just examined prior to the regrading, and then Central High School in the background. And then the original structure of Central High School, which seemed to be even larger. And numerous interesting theaters, some which still exist in Omaha to this day that you can see for yourself and interact with, and others that have been lost over time, such as the Rialto. So what's the true account with this city? Was this part of the building of a new era? The founding of Omaha? We look at these older images, whether they're from the 1890s to the 1920s, some even from the 1930s, and we see very, very impressive structures that were constructed early in this city's history. And it should be noted that this city did have a little bit of a turbulent history behind it. There were difficulties with natural disasters. There were difficulties with the ethnic groups that settled the city. It's a very similar tale across many other American cities, and yet it didn't stop Omaha from rapidly growing. It was even hit by a very destructive tornado, which officially destroyed a good portion of northern Omaha. Ah yes, look at that, advertising for Coca-Cola. This image from the very early 1900s. Well, at least that conforms with our expectations. Coca-Cola had been around, and it was probably widely available at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. Ah yes, the trolleys. And the trolleys being known for their employment in San Francisco. Interesting how in San Francisco, this date in history, August 2nd, 1873, the first successful cable car ran on San Francisco's Clay Street Hill Railroad. Yes, San Francisco, known for its tremendous inclines and hills, and yet their trolleys never seem to have any issue going up these hills, and we certainly don't have any account of a massive attempt at regrading in San Francisco. San Francisco still has its steep inclines, and their trolleys apparently never had any issue going up these inclines. So why exactly would the Omaha trolleys, or streetcars, or whatever we're calling them today, have any issue going up inclines? Why did this warrant a massive excavation effort to regrade these hills in the city of Omaha? Cities, or hills which still exist to this very day. And I will admit it is rather problematic when we look at this, because we have trolleys that are verified to be operational in even the smallest of towns across the Midwest. It wasn't as though trolleys were limited to the larger cities such as Omaha or Des Moines. We have trolley cars in the small towns of Tama, Iowa, and many others. So what was really going on with this regrading project? It looks to me like it's a little bit more extensive than just simply moving a hill. It appears as though there's a lot of dirt and debris that's being cleared around structures. And whether we're talking Central High School, which is another one of these impressive high schools. And by the way, how many Central High Schools do we have? I always think of the one in Duluth, Minnesota. It's as though Central High School was some sort of designation that was given to high school that is a definitive old world structure, and has another old world structure that's affiliated with it. And even the early images that we have of Central High School in Omaha once again give us this impression of this excavation project that had to be carried out. It's even more interesting when you consider the fact that current Central High School had another excavation project carried out in the front of it, and there's a lovely smokestack with it too. And then even looking at the original City Hall, the county courthouse, and the B building. What is it with everything being B in Omaha and Sioux Falls? You may recall that mill that we looked at. Very impressive structures with interesting mounds of dirt very precisely cut around them. Is that really what we're looking at? Or are we looking at something else? Look at this particular house here and this very large mound of dirt nearby. The City Hall and the buildings with large mounds of dirt around it. So what was really the intention behind this? Just simple regrading? The Douglas County Courthouse. Of course, this is not the current one, but the one that preceded it that just happened to be built next to it, or rather the new one would be built next to it. And what we have is this account that it was left on a pile of dirt from the regrading program. Yes, we always have the power lines. But there's also a challenge with that account, because the stairs were constructed after the courthouse was left on the pile of dirt, was it not? And yet in this particular image, or postcard, or whatever you want to call it, we have an indication that these stairs are just as old, if not older, than the county courthouse itself. Here you see it attached to the new and current courthouse before it was torn down. And the problem that I have with this account, the account that the courthouse was left on a pile of dirt and then they built the stairs. But here we have stairs and an entryway that goes right into the pile of dirt, does it not? What's really the intention behind this? And there are many images that do corroborate that account of this impressive entryway that just happens to go right into the pile of dirt. I mean, are we to assume that the courthouse did not have a foundation and a basement? No, of course it did. Every single one did. Every state capitol and courthouse had an extensive foundation. How exactly did you build a structure like that? This isn't some temporary balsa wood popsicle stick structure from the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. Or is it possible that this particular structure was part of the exposition? Yes, I always love what appear to be urns on these elaborate structures, and the other details that we do not have in our present government buildings. And even looking at the current courthouse that still stands, the Douglas County Courthouse in Omaha, Nebraska, the interior is very lavish and very beautiful, with incredible architectural detailing. But again, the explanation is going to be that we just simply cared about art back then. And you can look at all these images of this regrading, where we actually had to have a train apparently go over a 3-degree slope, which, is something very easy for trains to do. Just ask James May. And apparently they had trains that could do that. They also have the same story of a train aiding in the construction of the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Monument in nearby Des Moines. Ah, yes. more of this interesting dirt that appears present. Now, if you go walking around the city of Omaha today, you'll see what appears to be things that are still built in the dirt. Burlington Station, another lost train station in Omaha, and this was a historically documented structure. What an impressive entrance. No generated image here. This did really exist. What exactly are these figures alluding to here? Are these what Nebraskans looked like in the very early 1900s? I never get tired, though, of trying to understand exactly the way things unfolded in these cities. And it's as though the more you look at the official historical account, the more confusing things get. You would expect an easy reconciliation, a chronological, ordered construction that would make sense. But you see anything but when you actually study the images and the dates that are related to them. It seems to make things more confusing. Now, is this just a product of coincidences? Is it all just because that's the way things appear? That some of the buildings that we originally built were designed to look old? We call it rustication. Is this the original Central High School? Or is this a completely different structure that had a completely different purpose and was simply attributed to being the high school? Yet this is stated to be Central High School. But of course they built the much nicer one. Isn't it rather odd how it's the exact same story, and it seems to reflect the exact same story as the Douglas County Courthouse? It's one of those very difficult and problematic accounts that we have with two structures and two newer structures. And yet the story appears to repeat. Now again, it could simply be a coincidence. But when you look at all these detailed structures in and around Omaha, when you really try to understand the story, and I'm saying that, the story, that's what the account is, we do have a very well-documented history, and I have every intention of taking a very close look at the Durham Museum and evaluating what relics and artifacts that we have there. And the impressive City Hall. Yes, the old City Hall in Omaha. Another impressive structure with a massive clock tower on it. And I wonder if this structure were still standing and we looked at it, would we see certain impressions, engravings of amazing figures? Are there still structures in the old market of Omaha today that show these impressive and amazing figures? The griffins, the owls, and the very impressive godlike figures or deities that tend to have 14 or 18-pack abs. What exactly is this all about? Are we really hiding something with this particular city? Or have we just forgotten? It's really hard to say. Is this a trolley car, or is this just merely some kind of converted horse wagon that were put on tracks and then horses would pull up the hills? Well, then how exactly do we go about regrading this? Why do we have these conflicting accounts of these structures that are so close together? These structures that would serve the same purpose. The second courthouse, the third courthouse. The building that sits on top of a mound of dirt and yet has very intricate stairs and a massive entryway that seems to go right into the middle of the mound of dirt. And this is the same sort of account that we have in many other cities. The same stories. And yet, for whatever reason, it seems to have been preserved most effectively here in Omaha. It's flashing right in our face. All of the significant details of Mud Flood Ground Zero. We start with an exposition. We have a regrading project. We have numerous structures that have been torn down and rebuilt. And if you walk around the old market of Omaha today, you will see the remains of many of those old structures. You'll see the old icons that don't really make a lot of sense. And yes, Omaha went through its urban renewal, as we've discussed before, where many of these wonderful structures were lost over time. They were replaced by newer buildings, buildings with impressive glass and steel towers, that of course are taller, at least from our understanding, but are they truly and genuinely more impressive than these older structures? Here another picture of the impressive trolleys or the streetcars. Maybe we should just call them super vehicles that could go anywhere, unless of course you have to level the incline. How interesting that these structures can be verified in numerous different images. And there's also the unique situation in Omaha where we have many older buildings, or what we would define as old world buildings, that have been repurposed. Repurposed either into restaurants, or perhaps my favorite, a power plant that's of course been repurposed into a residential area. The old Rialto Theater, yes, Omaha has this story as well, where we have impressive theaters constructed in the 19-teens or the 1920s. They were only in operation for a few years, and then they were neglected. Of course, over the fullness of time, such as the Rialto Theater pictured here, it was torn down. And so we can't explore those structures. Yet other structures still survive, and you can explore them and examine them in detail. And I strongly recommend that you do this if you have access to Omaha or any other city or town nearby, where you can identify these older structures and really compare and contrast them with the newer buildings. Looking at the old skyline of Omaha from the very early 20th century, and once again being impressed by the array and variety in all the structures. And remember that the city had not even been in existence for this long at this point in time. Only about 5 decades, and yet they were able to achieve all this. And yet you have other images that give you the impression that there was a little bit of a shanty town that was also in existence at the same time. And what a contrast. Now, it could be possible that the prevailing economic situation could have contributed to this, but how is it that you have these wooden houses in this overgrown area that are so close to the large industrial area? We even have the old account of anarchists attacking the Douglas County Courthouse, detonating a bomb nearby, going back to the troubles that I referred to earlier, creating a lot of destruction. Tornadoes, radicals causing trouble, all sorts of issues. And we even have a very impressive grotto in nearby Omaha. Ah yes, a grotto with a door in it. I have to admit that's quite intriguing, an open door into a grotto. Well, I guess it's a grotto that you need to have access to, because would it really be a true grotto if you couldn't go inside and look at it from the inside? What exactly are these grottos in reality? And this grotto, of course, being a nearby Creighton University. And we naturally have these postcards, this image of this very impressive hospital, asylum. What do we want to call it? Officially, it's St. Joseph's Hospital, but we can see what it is. It's a compound of buildings. And so I leave it to you. What do you think was actually happening in Omaha? Do you think that this regrading project happened just as we were informed? Or was there something else entirely going on? That this was a massive excavation project to really remove this amount of dirt and enable access to these incredible old world buildings, to press them back into service, to use them once again? Does it just so happen that Omaha is one of the most direct examples that we have of various form of evidence? Evidence in the official historical account, evidence in terms of what happened to the structures, and even evidence that you can still go examine in person today, right here, right now, that gives you the impression that this really was a true city, that was the remnants of the old world, that did endure some kind of catastrophe, a cataclysm, a disaster. We call it the mud flood, but who knows exactly what happened? A amount of dirt, a massive landslide, a complete change in the nature of the land, we don't know. But it required a resettlement program, the area to be repopulated, an exposition to show the population who they were and what they were about, and efforts that continued for decades and maybe longer to repurpose and salvage these structures. And here, another incredible theater, a theater that does not exist today, that was lost to time, again with impressive details on the interior. What are your thoughts behind this? What do you think of Omaha? So what exactly do we have from the official historical account, the Central High School timeline, which indicates that between July 1919 and November 1921, Dodge Street was lowered to produce a gentler grade. Streetcars had a difficult time climbing the 12% grade, but apparently rail cars and steam engines had no issue going up that 12% grade. Forget James May. The street was lowered some 20 feet on the south side of Central, and the school grounds were recontoured, because apparently that was easy to do right after World War I. The fear of the unsightliness of the result of the grading was the subject of a January 9th, 1920 World Herald story. A plan had been floated by some real estate men and property owners, in quotations, to add to Central High School and eliminate unsightly approaches caused by the grading. Architects Ellert and Lahr drew up a rendering of Central High School, still with the intended courtyard tower in place, surrounded by a lower tier addition. They proposed the new space be used for a junior high or elementary school. Dodge Street grading. Note steam shovel. If steam shovels were this effective, why did we ever go away from using them? Well, perhaps there were some environmental considerations. I can't imagine why. But it just doesn't end there. The history and mystery of Central High School. Omaha eyes are drawn to the massive limestone building, and they tell us it's made of limestone. Is it? Towering over 20th and Dodge Streets. How could we miss it? But it's what we don't see that tells the history of Omaha Central High School. We don't see the buildings that sat there before. How very true. A commonly held misconception is that the current school building was the original Nebraska territorial capital. It wasn't. Are we sure? And we're going to be taking a close look at Nebraska's capitals here in a subsequent exploration, because there's quite an interesting one in nearby Lincoln. And the story doesn't end there. Currently, Omaha is undergoing a $1 billion makeover, or a $9 billion makeover in new development. Where exactly is this money coming from? I'm not certain, but we have numerous projects. A $200 million addition and renovation of the city's convention center. Omaha is known as the convention center of the land, the Omaha Airport. You may recall, if you're a fan of films, and the film Up in the Air was actually set in Omaha. That's where the character Ryan Bingham actually operated out of in his company, where he was contracted out to go fire people. Very interesting movie from 2009. And perhaps, for our purposes, the streetcar. A downtown streetcar. Downtown Omaha is set to welcome a $421 million streetcar in 2028. Ah, yes. So, not a trolley, this is a streetcar. The streetcar will run on a 3-mile route from Cass to Farnham on South 10th Street, Farnham west of 42nd Street, and back to 10th Street on Harney. Building momentum in Omaha, and here you can see the timeline behind this streetcar project. Research, studies, and planning, 2016 to 22. Preliminary design in 23. Final design, 23-24. Vehicle procurement. Oh, they already have the streetcars. Last year. Utility relocations and mainline track construction. Ongoing, or at least starting, 2026 to 2028. 2 whole years to do that. Testing and commissioning, and the streetcar in service in 2028. What a coincidence, looking at this particular streetcar route. No, it doesn't exactly run on Dodge, where they regraded it to enable the streetcar to run when it had a 12% slope. But they had a train, apparently, that could ascend that 12% slope without any issue. Or maybe it come from the other direction, I don't know. But here we can see a streetcar. An old world form of transportation, or at least a modern inclination of it. And again, I wonder, if you're a resident or a denizen of Omaha, where exactly is this money coming from? Local corporations, special taxes, something else? You can still visit Omaha today. You can see all of these sites for yourself. The old world buildings, the current construction in preparation for the new streetcar. You can experience the mystery. Do your own exploration. See the structures and try to reconcile them with all of the newer structures around them. Gain an understanding for what really transpired on this land over time. Even find these random structures where you'll see our favorite old world symbol, the griffin. Yes, why is it we encounter this symbol everywhere we go? This mythical creature that didn't really exist. This mythical creature that appears everywhere we look. So many different cities and so many different locations. What does it truly represent? Unless, of course, you want to accept the historical account that these fine talons and claws and amazing figure were some sort of prefabricated material, something that was done in the early 1900s or 1800s, according to the official historical account. And what do the rest of these symbols actually mean that you'll see in all these buildings in the old market? And it's not just in the old market. It's in many different locations in Omaha. It's in many towns and cities across the land where you'll see things that don't seem to add up from our understanding. Explore them. Look at them. Try to understand what they mean. What is this material made out of? What do these symbols really mean? And what will happen once the streetcar is complete? Why is there a history of excavation in Omaha that continues to this day? Ah, yes, and we're building another one of our new modern buildings. As they say, glass is forever. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Zax may be a killer, but in the end, he is not the real enemy. Hatred is.